I hope all of you would be good and welcome you back to another important lecture. And for today, we will be looking on toward the third major component that we have for the transport in human, and this is the blood vessels with us. If I were to recall some of the things from the previous lecture, so you know that I told you that whenever the transport system of the human has to be made, so we require a heart, we require the blood, and we are in the need of the blood vessels. So as far as the blood vessels are to be bothered, so the human body actually possesses three major type of the blood vessels, and among them we have the arteries coming, then we will have these veins coming, and then we have these miniature kind of or a mini kind of the blood vessels with us, and they are entitled as the blood capillaries. If I were to talk about the arteries, so you see these arteries, they would carry the blood away from the heart, and that blood in most of the arteries would be the oxygenated blood that will have higher proportion of the oxygen gas comparative to the proportion of the carbon dioxide gas. But there was an exception, as I told you in the section of the heart, that this is only the pulmonary arteries that we have in our body. They also carry the blood away from the heart, but it would be the deoxygenated blood. If I were to talk about the veins, so wherever the veins would be there in the body, so they would always bring the blood back to the heart. And in all of the veins of the body, the blood is deoxygenated blood. That means that it would have greater proportion of the carbon dioxide relative to the proportion of the oxygen gas. But there would be an exception coming, and the exception would again be in case of the pulmonary vein. Now, since the word is vein, so it would bring the blood back to the heart, but that would be an oxygenated blood in it. And if I were to tell you about these miniature blood capillaries, so they would carry the blood in between the arteries and the veins, and these are actually the blood capillaries where the exchange of the materials would take place. Now, the other situation is that how come the general distribution of the blood happens within these blood vessels? So initially there would be the presence of this artery. The artery would carry the blood into the small arteries, they are the arterioles, and the blood would come or would go into the blood capillaries. From the blood capillaries, the blood would be taken into the venules, and from the venules it would end up coming into the veins. So if you were to see this handmade diagram for you. So initially the blood is coming into the artery. From here it would go into the arteriole, and then from there it would go into the blood capillaries. From this it would come into the venules, and lastly we would again have the blood coming to the veins that would take it into the heart, and from the heart again the arteries would originate out. So the first idea would be that we must be very much clear about that how come the structures or how come the morphology of these blood vessels they would look like. So this is the same diagram as I've shown you above. So I have got this artery coming. Here we would have this arteriole. Here is a blood capillaries. Then there is venules, and ultimately we have the veins. And if we just try to see the differences, so for the arteries, if you see, we have got their lumen, and this lumen is an empty space through which the blood would flow, and the lumen of the artery is comparative to the lumen of the vein, so this is comparatively smaller. But if I were to make you understand the thickness that we have got for the middle layer of the artery, so this comparatively is more thicker as we have got in case of the veins. Okay, so this is how the structures they would appear different in case of the arteries and the veins, and we will see in detail coming up. So now if I were to show you the bigger diagram of this artery that we have and the bigger diagram for this vein that we have got, so if you see, like no matter if we have the artery or if we have the vein, so their wall would comprise of three layers. Like for the arteries, I have this inner layer, and for the vein, again, I have got this inner layer. For the arteries and the veins, again, we have got their middle layer coming here, and then on the outside, we have got their third layer or external layer. If you were to see again, the lumen is smaller for the arteries and the lumen is wider for the veins, but the wall thickness is greater for the arteries and the wall thickness is less for the veins that we have here. So now what we have to understand is that if we have the inner layer of the arteries and if we have the middle and the external layer of the arteries, then what would be lying within these layers? And the same we would see for the veins as well. So if I would simply take you to a bigger diagram of this artery again, knee diagram. So this is the lumen of the artery through which the blood would be flowing. This is the inner layer of the arteries, and it would have the endothelial cells in it. And then we have got this middle layer coming up for the arteries. And this middle layer, it has got a great proportion of the smooth collagen and elastic fibers in it, and that actually provide the arteries a lot of strength so that they don't burst. And here you see on the outside we have this external layer of the arteries. Now, if you were to be knowing these points, so you see that the inner layer of the arteries, it has some, you could say, cells, and these cells, they are the endothelial cells. And the endothelial cells, their shape is very characteristic. It would have the tapering ends, and the nucleus would be there at the center of these cells. So this inner layer of the arteries is made up of these endothelial cells. And if I were to talk about the middle layer that we have in the arteries, as I've shown you below, so in the middle layer, we have this collagen protein, we have this elastic fiber, and then we have got a greater proportion of these muscles, and these muscles, they are the smooth muscles, and the smooth muscles, wherever they would be in our body, they would be involuntary muscles, as we would not have any control on how frequently we would be able to be making them contract or relax. So they are actually not under the control of your will. And if I were to tell you about the outer layer of the arteries, so it would have a connective tissue. For your course, this is not required at what outer layer is made up of. Now, if I quickly take you to that, how come the structure of the artery is related to the function. So as I have said earlier, that for these arteries, the inner layer is made up of these endothelial cells. So that inner layer is since made up of very thin cells. So in that way, it would be lowering the friction that the blood is creating on the walls of these arteries. So the endothelial cells has got a role in reducing the friction to the flow of the blood. The other important two characteristics which the arteries they perform is that they need to have a lot of strength in them. Because the situation is that these arteries they receive the blood directly from the heart, so they kind of experience a lot of higher pressure exerted on their walls, so there is a possibility that these arteries can burst. But the arteries, they have got a solution for that because they keep their middle layer very thick in context of having a greater proportion of the smooth muscle, the elastic, and the collagen fibers. So these give the arteries the strength, and by that strength, the arteries at any cost they would not burst. The other thing that we have to be understanding is that these arteries, they also have an ability to be undergoing recoiling, or this is also the elasticity characteristic of the arteries. And by the elasticity, what we mean is that when we cause the ventricles of the heart to contract, so the heart is basically sending the blood under very high pressure. So what these arteries do, they dilate their lumen or they increase in their lumen. When they increase their lumens, ultimately the blood pressure would be reduced then. The other situation is that when my heart ventricles they are relaxing, so the pressure of the blood is reduced, so the arteries they would constrict inside, and in that way the pressure of the blood would be increased in the arteries. So you see that the arteries walls they are doing opposite to what the heart is doing. When the heart ventricles are contracting, they dilate their lumen so that the pressure of the blood is reduced. When the heart ventricles are relaxing, they constrict their lumen so that they can increase the pressure of the blood. So in this way, the arteries they are regulating the pressure of the blood along the entire length of the body. So this is actually the elasticity that we have in case of these arteries. And by the elasticity, what we mean is that these arteries they maintain the blood pressure by undergoing the dilation and by undergoing the constriction. For the dilation thing, as I have said, that when the ventricular systole is happening and when the ventricles of the heart are contracting, so the blood pressure in the arteries would increase. And these arteries, they would widen up their lumen, and by that, the blood pressure in the arteries would reduce. And when we talk with context to the constriction, so when in the heart the ventricular diastole is happening, so the blood pressure in the arteries would decrease. These arteries, when they constrict, so they narrow their lumen up, and in that way, they would increase the pressure of the blood. And by the dilation and the constriction, the advantage that we are getting is that over the entire length of the arteries, the blood pressure would be maintained. Now let us go on toward the veins now. After we are done with the arteries, now I will show you a bigger diagram of the veins. So if you see that these veins, unlike the arteries, they do not have a narrow lumen, but rather than they have in themselves a wider lumen coming up. Like the arteries, they have got their inner wall or the inner layer, then they have their middle layer coming here, and then for these veins, we have got their external layer coming or the external wall of the vein coming. But the thing is that the thickness of the middle layer in case of the vein comparatively is less as compared to that of the arteries. And the other situation is that these veins they also have the semilunar walls in them, which is not a characteristic of the arteries. So again, the inner layer of these veins they would be made up of the endothelium cells. The middle layer that we have in the vein it would have the smooth muscles and the elastic fiber, but the proportion comparatively would be less. And then they also have got this thinner outer layer in them, and they also have the semilunar walls in them. So if you just look on toward this, so for the veins like the arteries, their inner layer is made up of the endothelial cells. The middle layer is made up of the collagen, elastic, and the smooth muscles. And these smooth muscles, like the arteries, are involuntary muscles, but the content of the smooth muscles and the elastic fiber in the middle layer of the vein is comparatively less as compared to that of arteries. And like the arteries, their outer layer is thin but is made up of the connective tissue. Now, the other thing is that we must be able to relate the structures that we have in the veins to the function which they are performing. The first idea was that for these veins, we have got their wider lumen. And when they would have their wider lumens, it would allow more of the blood to be carried on. The middle layer of this vein, they are comparatively less thin. The reason is that the blood pressure in the veins is not that high, so they need not to have a greater thickness of their middle layer. And you know that the veins, since they are bringing the blood from the lower body parts also, and the gravity would be acting on this blood downwards, so there could be the backflow of the blood. So what these veins they do is that along their length, they have these semilunar walls, and these semilunar walls they would prevent the backflow of the blood. The other thing is that the veins they usually are lying superficially, like wherever we would have these skeletal muscles, the muscles which are attached to the bones. So the veins they would lie in close association with them. The reason is that when we would be contracting our muscles, so they would exert the pressure on the blood that is flowing in the veins. So in that way, they would assist in the movement of the blood in the veins of the body. So I hope you would be clear with the structure and the morphology of the arteries and the veins and how come their structure they are related to the function. And in the next class, we would be looking on toward the blood capillaries.